The stench of rotting flesh, mingled with sacred incense, assaulted the Templar knight's nostrils on the morning of August 25th, 1270. Inside the royal tent, what had once been the most powerful man in Western Christendom lay upon a damp straw mattress, his skin yellowed and peeling like ancient parchment. Louis IX of France, the saintly king, the man who had defied emperors and faced the Saracens, was now little more than a skeleton cloaked in a translucent film of decaying flesh. But the true horror did not lie in the grotesque sight of his physical decline. It lay in what had been deliberately hidden from the official records, whispered only among his confessors and closest chroniclers, buried beneath layers of hagiography and royal propaganda. 3 decades earlier, in 1240, Louis had risen as the supreme example of medieval Christian royalty. At 26, his presence dominated the halls of Vincennes and the Louvre with an authority that transcended mere inheritance. Tall, broad-shouldered, his golden hair catching the light of stained glass windows as if blessed by Christ himself, he embodied the chivalric ideal that troubadours sang of in their ballads. His blue eyes, described by the chronicler Joinville as deep as mountain lakes, possessed an intensity that made even veteran nobles lower their gaze in involuntary reverence. When he walked the stone corridors of the palace, the whisper of his silk robes and the faint jingle of his silver spurs created a symphony of power that echoed through the Gothic vaults. In those golden years, France flourished under his aegis like never before. Notre Dame Cathedral and the Sainte-Chapelle rose majestically, their towers piercing the sky like divine fingers pointing toward paradise. The markets of Paris overflowed with Eastern spices, Byzantine silks and African ivory, while the royal coffers swelled with gold flowing along prosperous trade routes. Louis was not merely a king. He was a force of nature, a catalyst of faith and civilization that transformed everything he touched. His hands, pale and aristocratic, yet calloused from wielding a sword, dispensed justice with surgical precision that even impressed his enemies. During morning audiences, his deep, melodious voice resonated across ancient stones, proclaiming sentences that became legend and establishing precedents that would endure for centuries. Yet, the obsession with the heavenly Jerusalem already fermented in his mind like a wine souring slowly. Since childhood, fed by the epic tales of his grandfather Philip Augustus and the fiery accounts of veterans from the Third Crusade, Louis had harbored a burning passion for the Holy Land that bordered on mania. On silent winter nights, when the wind howled through the battlements of the castle, he would lock himself in his private chambers, bent over yellowed maps and illuminated manuscripts detailing every stone of Jerusalem, every bend of the Jordan River, every hill of Golgotha. His prayers stretched for hours, his tears falling onto the cold mosaics as he begged God for the opportunity to liberate the Holy Sepulchre from the hands of the infidels. The First Crusade expedition, launched in 1248, began with a pomp that eclipsed even coronation ceremonies. In Saint-Denis Basilica, as he received the pilgrim's staff from the papal legate, Louis radiated an aura of divine determination that made those present believe they witnessed a new Constantine marching to conquer the world for Christ. His wife, Margaret, pregnant and pale as candle wax, watched from the upper gallery, silent tears tracing down her aristocratic cheeks, perhaps sensing that she was seeing the man she loved in his full glory for the last time. But Egypt revealed itself as a nightmare surpassing the worst fears of French strategists. The Nile Delta, with its treacherous marshes and suffocating heat, became the tomb of Crusader dreams. Dysentery swept through Christian ranks like an invisible scythe, felling knights who had survived decades of European battles. Louis, captured at Mansoura after a humiliating defeat, spent months in Saracen captivity, where he witnessed horrors never fully documented in official records. Joinville, in his more private moments, whispered of the psychological tortures imposed by the Mamluks, how they forced the Christian king to watch ritual executions of his own men, how their captors muttered blasphemies in his ear during long nights of imprisonment. When he was finally ransomed for an astronomical price that impoverished France for a generation, Louis returned transformed. The change was not immediately visible. His courtiers, relieved to see him alive, interpreted his newfound sobriety as wisdom gained through suffering. But those who knew him intimately perceived subtle and disturbing alterations. His eyes, once bright as sapphires, had acquired a glassy quality, as if constantly focused on some distant horror only he could see. His hands, previously firm and decisive, developed an almost imperceptible tremor that became more pronounced during religious ceremonies. At night, servants reported muffled cries emanating from his chambers, followed by hours of whispered prayers in Latin and Arabic, a language he had never officially learned. The French court, accustomed to splendor and royal confidence, began to notice cracks in the facade of sanctity. During banquets, Louis would often interrupt conversations to fix his gaze on empty corners of the hall, as if observing figures, invisible to his attendants. His diet became sparse and ritualistic. He refused red meat, claiming it brought him impure visions, subsisting mainly on bread, watered-down wine, and fruit. His complexion, once rosy and healthy, took on a waxy pallor that the court physicians attributed to excessive fasting and penance. Margaret, his devoted wife, began documenting in private letters to her sister Blanche of Castile the alarming changes in conjugal behavior. "My lord no longer seeks me as his wife," she wrote in a missive dated 1254, "but kneels at the foot of our bed for hours, murmuring names in Saracen tongues and scratching his own flesh until it bleeds. When I question him about such practices, his eyes take on a wild expression, as if I were a stranger invading his chambers." These letters, preserved in the secret archives of Castile and discovered only in the 17th century, reveal a terrifying progression of symptoms that modern physicians would recognize as signs of severe psychological trauma combined with possible chronic poisoning. The Second Crusade, launched in 1270, emerged not from calculated political strategy, but from a near-manic compulsion consuming Louis like a cerebral fever. His advisors, led by the shrewd Stephen Boileau, tried to dissuade him with rational arguments about the kingdom's finances and domestic political instability. But the king had transcended earthly logic. He constantly spoke of angelic voices, calling him to a final mission of celestial signs that only he could interpret. During a royal council meeting in May 1270, witnesses report that Louis interrupted a discussion on taxes to point at an empty window and declare, "Do you see? Saint Aloysius Gonzaga calls me to eternal glory." The embarrassed silence that followed was broken only by the discreet sobs of his mother, Queen Blanche. The journey to Tunis proved to be a funeral procession, disguised as a military expedition. The ships that departed from Aigues-Mortes carried not only soldiers and supplies, but a king already descending into the abyss of spiritual madness. Joinville, now an elderly man who chose not to accompany this second venture, recorded in his memoirs a final conversation with Louis in which the monarch confessed to having visions of the Prophet Muhammad coming to convert me to Islam in my dreams. When Joinville expressed horror at such blasphemy, Louis laughed, a sound described as clear yet hollow, like cracked bells tolling in an abandoned church. The Christian camp near Carthage quickly transformed into a medieval charnel house. Plague, dysentery, and a mysterious red fever that caused hemorrhaging through the pores began to decimate the French troops with an efficiency surpassing any Saracen army. But the most disturbing spectacle was the king himself. Eyewitnesses, including his son Philip and several Templar knights, described a physical transformation bordering on the supernatural. In a matter of weeks, Louis lost over 20 kilograms, 50 pounds. His skin took on a yellowish hue with dark patches spreading like ink blotches over wet parchment, and his hair, once golden, turned white as mountain snow. More unsettling still were his behavioral changes. The king began speaking fluent Arabic during his fevered deliriums, reciting verses from the Quran with a precision that terrified the ecclesiastics present. At night, he would shout the names of Mamluk warriors he had known in captivity, begging forgiveness in Arabic for sins he never specified. His personal attendants reported that he constantly scratched at a crescent-shaped mark that had appeared on his chest, a wound that bled continuously despite all treatments administered by the court physicians. Abbot William of Nangis, the official chronicler of the expedition, recorded in his personal diary details that were later censored from the official chronicles. "Our most holy king has become a creature of God or of the devil, I cannot discern," he wrote on August 20th. "Today I saw him speaking animatedly to empty air, addressing someone called Baybars, whom I recognize as the name of the Sultan who defeated us in Egypt. His words were of submission and repentance, as if confessing crimes against Islam. When I approached to hear him better, he turned to me with eyes glowing like embers and declared in perfect Arabic, 'Allahu Akbar, la ilaha illa Allah.' I fled in horror, for I feared I was witnessing the damnation of a Christian soul." As August progressed, Louis's condition deteriorated beyond any possibility of concealment. His skin began to slough off in large sheets, revealing underlying flesh that appeared seared by an inner fire. His nails turned black and started to detach, while his teeth took on a greenish tint that the physicians could not explain. The odor emanating from his body was described by those present as a mixture of burnt incense, congealed blood, and something indefinably Eastern, like spices spoiled under the desert sun. More terrifying still was his behavior during moments of lucidity. He alternated between periods of religious delirium, when he shouted blasphemies in Arabic, and moments of horrifying clarity when he seemed fully aware of his grotesque transformation. During one such lucid interval, he summoned his confessor, the Dominican friar Geoffrey de Beaulieu, and whispered a confession into his ear, sealed under sacramental secrecy. Geoffrey never revealed the contents of that confession, but witnesses report that the friar left the royal tent with his face contorted by horror and could never again celebrate Mass without trembling violently. Philip, the future Philip III, kept a constant vigil beside his dying father, but even he avoided touching the king's skin directly. In his letters to his mother, Isabella of Aragon, he described scenes that seemed lifted from the worst medieval nightmares of demonic possession. "My father speaks with voices that are not his own," he wrote on August 23rd. "At one moment, it is the voice of a crying child. At another, that of an elderly man pleading in Arabic. At times, something that does not even sound human. His eyes move independently of one another, as if each eye observes a different world. Yesterday, for several minutes, he spoke with perfect clarity about people and places in Egypt he had never mentioned before, describing tortures and humiliations with details that made me vomit." The morning of August 25th brought with it a supernatural silence that fell upon the entire Christian camp. Birds ceased their song, horses stopped neighing, and even the Mediterranean breeze seemed to sigh and die. Inside the royal tent, Louis lay on an improvised bed, his breathing reduced to a raspy whisper that seemed to come from an unfathomable distance. His skin had taken on a cadaverous translucence, through which one could see dark veins snaking like rivers of ink. His lips, cracked and bleeding, moved constantly in silent prayers, alternating between Latin and Arabic with a fluency that continued to disturb those present. Around midday, As the relentless Mediterranean sun reached its zenith, Louis opened his eyes for the last time. Those present, Philip, Geoffrey de Beaulieu, a few Templar knights and French nobles, later reported that his eyes no longer appeared human. The irises had taken on a golden hue that pulsed with an inner light, while the pupils were so dilated that they nearly obliterated any trace of color. For a few eternal seconds, he swept his gaze across the interior of the tent, as though seeing through the dimensions of time and space. Then, with a voice echoing as if it came from a deep well, he pronounced his final words, not in French or Latin, as would have been expected of a Christian king, but in fluent Arabic. Allahu A'lam, Bil-Ghaib wal-Shahada. God knows the unseen and the seen. Immediately afterward, his body was convulsed by a violent spasm that made the makeshift bed shake, his limbs contorting at impossible angles, and an inhuman scream, described by those present as the sound of 1,000 demons being exorcised, simultaneously escaped from his ravaged throat. The silence that followed was broken by a phenomenon no chronicler could adequately explain. The body of Louis, which moments before had exuded the pestilential odor of decay, began to emit an intense fragrance of roses and incense that filled the entire tent and spread throughout the camp. Simultaneously, his skin regained a healthy, rosy hue. His wounds closed instantly, and his expression took on an angelic serenity that stood in stark contrast to the preceding hours of agony. But it was Geoffrey de Beaulieu who noticed the most disturbing detail. As he prepared the body for the funeral rites, he discovered that the crescent-shaped mark on the king's chest had vanished entirely, replaced by a scar in the shape of a cross that seemed to have been engraved into the flesh by divine hands. When he tried to document this transformation, he found that his ink refused to adhere to the parchment whenever he attempted to describe the most supernatural events, as if invisible forces conspired to keep certain truths hidden from the historical record. The canonization of Louis the Mine, proclaimed by Pope Boniface VIII in 1297, was based on a carefully edited version of his death, in which the most disturbing elements were omitted or reinterpreted as signs of sanctity. The miracles reported in his cause for beatification, unexplained healings, celestial visions, supernatural fragrances, may very well have been manifestations of forces that transcended medieval theological understanding. The secret documents of the Vatican, sealed by papal order and never made public, supposedly contain full testimonies of those present at the king's death, including details that would question not only his sanctity, but the very nature of spiritual reality. Centuries later, when the mortal remains of St. Louis were examined during the French Revolution, anatomists discovered inexplicable anomalies. His skeleton bore signs of internal burns that did not correspond to any known disease, while fragments of metal inscribed in Arabic were found embedded in the bones of his spine. These artifacts, confiscated by revolutionary authorities and later lost during the turmoil of 1794, were described by witnesses as Islamic amulets intended to protect against malevolent jinns. The truth about Louis IX's death remains, buried beneath layers of official hagiography and ecclesiastical secrets. But for those able to read between the lines of historical records, decipher the whispers of medieval chroniclers, and interpret the eloquent silences of censored documents, a very different portrait of the saintly king emerges. A man who, in his obsessive pursuit of celestial glory, may have ventured into spiritual territories that Orthodox Christianity preferred not to acknowledge. A monarch who, in his attempt to conquer the East for Christ, may himself have been conquered by Eastern forces far older and more complex than medieval theologians could comprehend. Louis IX's death was not merely the end of a reign or the birth of a saint. It was the manifestation of a mystery that continues to echo through the centuries. a disturbing demonstration that the boundaries between the sacred and the profane, between Christian faith and Eastern wisdom, between sanctity and possession, are far more tenuous than official history dares to admit. In August 1270 in Tunis, something far more complex and terrifying than a simple royal death occurred. Something that ecclesiastical and secular powers tacitly agreed to conceal from humanity, thereby preserving both the reputation of the French monarchy and the doctrinal stability of the Church. And so, the man who had departed from France as the supreme example of medieval Christendom returned as a living and dead paradox. A saint whose holiness may have been attained through pathways challenging all orthodox theological understanding, leaving posterity not only a legacy of devotion, but a mystery that continues to whisper through the dark corridors of history, questioning the very foundations upon which we build our understanding of the sacred.